The story of Tom and Sally is the longest-running miniseries or soap opera in American history.
How she felt about him? Who knows? Being owned is not exactly a desirable state of affairs.
They were together longer than some marriages exist. Yes, I understand she was a slave, but I also know that slaves did fall in love at some point.
In the foothills of Charlottesville, Virginia is Monticello, home of Thomas Jefferson, our nation's third president. Thomas Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal, and during the American Revolution, he actively promoted Indian slavery. However, Jefferson owned more than 600 people during his lifetime. Still, one caught his eye, the young Sally Hemings, with whom he had a mysterious relationship with that affected him politically. How and when did it start? After the death of Thomas Jefferson's father, Peter Jefferson, in 1757, Jefferson received 2,500 acres of land and some 30 slaves. Jefferson had huge responsibilities. In Fran Brody's book, Thomas Jefferson, An Intimate History, she discusses the 4 forbidden women in Thomas Jefferson's life. The first woman would be Betsy Walker. Betsy's husband, John, was a close friend of Jefferson's. According to Brody, in the summer of 1768, John Walker went to Fort St. Louis to help fashion a treaty with American Indians. He asked Jefferson to look after his wife and child in his absence. John even prepared his will and left Jefferson the executor in the event he didn't return. The second forbidden woman in his life would be Martha Wayles Skelton. Just 27 years old, Jefferson fell for her. However, what makes her forbidden? Brody claims that there is slight evidence that Jefferson's mother disapproved of the marriage. The third woman was Maria Cosway, and many historians and biographers don't want to believe that the affection he had for her was really. The fourth woman that's forbidden was Jefferson's slave, Sally Hemings. The interest in Hemings and the idea that she might have been Thomas Jefferson's lover have lasted with varying degrees of intensity for almost 2 centuries. However, very little is known about the woman whose identity has become linked to that of one of the most famous men in history. In the 1730s, Elizabeth Hemings was born. Elizabeth's mother was African and her father was English. Elizabeth Hemings would have 12 children. 6 of them would be fathered by John Wayles, who was Jefferson's father-in-law. According to Gordon Reed, under law, Elizabeth Hemings' father had no right to her, and if he wanted his child, unless her owner, in the spirit of generosity, wanted to give her away, he would have had to buy her. However, Wayles didn't own Hemings at birth because he lived near Williamsburg, Virginia. Martha Eppes Wayles' father died in 1734. According to Gordon Reed, by his will drafted in 1733, Eppes set out with great specifically what property he wanted to leave to each children. To Sally Hemings in 1773 at a Charles City plantation. It was rumored Wayles took Hemings as his concubine, and that's how Sally was born. Due to law, Sally Hemings would be born into slavery. The following year, Elizabeth Hemings, along with her children, arrived at Monticello. As the daughter of a man who was white, a woman who was half white, Sally Hemings was, according to the racial classifications of the day, a quadrant. 8 years after arriving at Monticello, Jefferson experienced the worst day of his life. Martha Jefferson passed away on September 6, 1782, from complications from childbirth. While Martha was dying, Jefferson promised her he would never remarry. However, Jefferson didn't completely keep his promise that he made to Martha. Thomas would develop a relationship with 14-year-old Sally Hemings. The relationship would last 38 years. At the age of 14, Sally was chosen by Jefferson's sister-in-law to travel with him to Paris. Sally Hemings went to France with Maria Jefferson when she was a little girl. Mr. Jefferson was minister to France, and he wanted to put her in school there. They crossed the ocean alone. Quote from Edmund Bacon.
Would you like to try it on?
You were supposed to stay over there and be free. Proper English and French clothes don't make you nothing but a fancy slave.
They crossed the ocean alone. Bacon. I have heard her tell about it. Compared to Jefferson's other slaves, Sally received better treatment, and it started in Paris. Smallpox was spreading throughout Paris. Thomas Jefferson would spend 240 francs on a vaccination for Miss Hemings. Sally, along with her brother James, began to receive 24 francs and 12 francs for the holiday season. Jefferson spent so much money on clothes for Sally that it helped with her self-esteem. According to Hallchalk in Jefferson's record, he spent a surprising amount of money on Mrs. Hemings' clothes. One thing that many historians bring up is that Jefferson's daughter Patsy asked to become a nun because she knew of her father's secret affair. Neither Jefferson nor anyone else gave reason for the sudden rise in his spending on Hemings, although Fawn Brodie portrayed this as signaling the beginning of the relationship. Sally Hemings had to be dressed properly because she attended dinner parties as a lady's maid with Jefferson's daughter. Many of the schoolmates knew Sally Hemings well. Not a shred of evidence exists that any of Jefferson's friends in Paris or anyone on his staff ever mentioned a relationship with Sally. Business records of Jefferson's are helpful. However, there are no records about a child born to Sally in 1790. Many believe he brought her an elaborate wardrobe as proof of their relationship. Before returning back to Monticello with Jefferson, things were bumpy between the two. According to Sex, Power, and Slavery, she refused to return with him to induce her to do so, so he promised her extraordinary privileges and made a solemn pledge that her children would be freed at the age of 21. However, Sally Hemings returned back to Monticello, and according to her son Madison Hemings, she was just beginning to understand the French language well, and in French she was free. Before returning back to Monticello with Jefferson, things were bumpy between the two. According to Sex, Power, and Slavery, she refused to return with him to induce her to do so. He promised her extraordinary privileges and made a solemn pledge that her children would be freed at the age of 21. However, Sally Hemings returned back to Monticello, and according to her son Madison Hemings, she was just beginning to understand the French language well, and in French she was free. According to Jefferson's own business records, Sally gave birth to 5 children in Virginia, only 4 of whom survived: Harriet, Beverly, Madison, and Eston. The other died in infancy. The following information comes from Jefferson's farm book. All the dates of Sally's children are taken from this book. However, when he entered each date is completely unknown because he wasn't present at every birth. Harriet Hemings was the first child Sally Hemings gave birth to at Monticello. Born on October the 5th, 1795, she died 2 years later. Conception calculated on or about January the 11th, 1795. Jefferson was staying at Monticello in January 1794 because he resigned as Secretary of State. Sally's son Eston, born in 1807, Jefferson had access to Sally at 2 different times in the year. The dates Jefferson was staying at Monticello were between April the 10th and May 16th, and then again on August 4th and October the 3rd. Jefferson was the only resident during this time. Another child Beverly was born in April 1798. The conception is dated July the 8th, 1797. Next, the second Harriet was born around December the 7th, 1799. Conception was mid-March 1799. Jefferson returned back to Monticello on March the 8th. After the birth of Harriet II, Sally wouldn't have another child for 2 years. May 1801, according to Highland Jr., shortly after Jefferson became president, Sally gave birth. The conception was August of 1800. Jefferson was present in Monticello from May 29th through November. After Harriet's birth, 3 years went by without a birth being listed in Jefferson's farm book. January 1805, Madison Hemings was born, conceived on or about April 27, 1804. Jefferson was at Monticello during the time of conception. Record indicates that he left Monticello on May the 11th and was not at Monticello for Madison's birth. James Callender. How did the relationship affect Jefferson politically? James Callender published an article in the Recorder on September the 1st, 1802. Many scholars believe the article was published because Callender had turned against Jefferson. Highland Jr. argues that the most direct statement that can be made about the alleged sexual relationship between Jefferson and Hemings is this: it was invented by the fractured psyche of an alcoholic hack journalist, James. In 1804, things got heated with Jefferson. He would be seeking re-election as America's third president. Things also occurred between John Adams and Jefferson
Of Eston Hemings and obtained a DNA sample to determine if the lineage traced back to Jefferson.
Character.
The New York Times.
James Callender was trouble for Jefferson and a huge political enemy. Jefferson's political enemies stated that in his involvement with Black Sal made him unfit for the nation's highest office. Madison Hemings' Life Among the Lonely. He writes about his father, Thomas Jefferson, and Sally Hemings, his mother, and his enslaved upbringing. In his text, he mentions how the only white man he knew with the last name of Hemings was his great-grandfather. In Thomas Jefferson's will, he would free 5 slaves, all males of the Hemings family, 2 of his sons, Sally's half-brother, and her 2 nephews. Many scholars believe that Jefferson liked Sally because she looked like Martha. On October the 31st, 1998, marks a watershed in Jefferson's study. October the 31st, 1998, marks a watershed in Jefferson's studies. On that day, Nature lifted its press embargo on a DNA study suggesting that Thomas Jefferson, or a male line relative, was the father of Sally Hemings' youngest son, Eston.